There is light at the end of the tunnel for the economy as inflation and interest rates continue to ease.
The period of challenge is going to be coming to an end soon.
A pinprick of light at the end of the tunnel, but the pain is far from over.
Over the past year, the number of people out of work has jumped from 33,000 to 143,000.
Hundreds of jobs in Ruapehu are on the chopping block.
We are still leaving the country in record numbers. One, they're mainly the young. Two, it isn't stopping. Places like Wellington are being hollowed out.
Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly, and today on The Detail, the economic pain, the squeeze had to happen, we're told. We're living way beyond our means. But did it have to be so tough? Is this what austerity looks like?
When the government is cutting spending, when clearly public services are needed, then that's austerity. And when you're doing it and it reduces the size of the government relative to the size of the economy, effectively putting a sinking lid on the size of government, that's austerity, and that's what this government's doing.
We'll hear more from business journalist Bernard Hickey of the Kaka, but first, here's the Herald's deputy political editor Thomas Coughlan with the good news and the bad news.
New Zealanders feel like they're in a funk, and the data supports that. We are in a funk. GDP per capita has gone backwards in recent years. The economy is not growing at the speed it would need to keep up with our growing population. So that means if you feel like you're worse off, it's because you probably are worse off. Unemployment is rising as a result of interest rates being hiked.
More people are out of work, with young people among the hardest hit. Stats NZ revealing today in the March quarter, the unemployment rate has risen from 4.4% to 4.6%.
Unemployment is forecast to continue to rise to 5.4%. So if you feel bad, take comfort in the fact that it's not just you. Things are really bad. There are a couple of things to look forward to.
Now with interest rates starting to come down, there's a little bit more certainty about when things will start getting better.
The forecasts are for interest rates to reduce. That means that many households will have far more money to spend, which will stimulate demand in the economy and reduce that unemployment and get the economy growing again. But it will feel bad for some time.
What is it? Survive until the end of 2025?
Survive till 25, yes, that's the mantra.
Yeah, I mean, and you must see it even more in Wellington than we see it here because of the cuts to public servants.
Yes, Wellington is particularly dependent on the public service and has become more so in the last few decades as companies moved their head offices to Auckland. In previous years, it was not uncommon for oil companies and banks to have head offices here, but that is all gone now. There are a number of things that are difficult about Wellington. Rates increases are big because we've had this water underinvestment crisis.
Well, Wellington Water's warning that fixing the region's water woes would take about $1 billion every year.
We have high commercial rates in Wellington, high insurance bills in Wellington because of the big one.
The risk of a major earthquake on the Alpine Fault has risen significantly. There's an 82% chance of it being magnitude 8 or greater. And
then, of course, there's the public service retrenchment, with the government indicating it wants to spend less on the core public service than had been forecast. Now, the spending on the public service isn't going backwards, it's just not growing like it was in the past, and that means that public service departments are shedding staff.
With that total expected to reach over 7,000.
And you do see that on the streets of Wellington.
There are fears that Wellington could soon become a bit of a ghost town.
The increase in people working from home after the pandemic and the more than 6,000 public service jobs axed by the coalition government means fewer people are in central Wellington on weekdays.
There are so many vacant buildings, so many vacant shop fronts as well, and that will be a combination of all those factors. And of course the high interest rates, which mean that people just aren't buying things and going to restaurants like they used to because they don't have the money.
Was this expected to happen, do you think? The combination, I suppose, of the Reserve Bank raising the official cash rate so that the banks raise the mortgage rates, but also the government taking these really tough cost-cutting measures. Were we expected to have these closures of cafes and little shops and that kind of thing?
The short answer is yes. The extent to which the official cash rate was going to be hiked and the length of time it would stay so high and the extent of the recession that would result from it. We had triple-dip recession now, which is quite uniquely bad. A whole monetary system is built around the fact that inflation is really bad. The reason why that is in the 20th century, we saw many economies completely be destroyed by high inflation. The famous one is Weimar Germany, which preceded the rise of the Nazi Party. You've seen it in Argentina, Zimbabwe, a number of South American economies. Inflation wrecks societies. It doesn't hurt everyone equally, but it hurts everyone. But people on the bottom get smashed from rapidly rising prices. So we've designed this whole system which allows the Reserve Bank to put the economy through an enormous amount of pain because we collectively have decided as a society that pain is worth it because inflation is worse. It is interesting in some corners of the political debate that people are discussing the way that we use the system to kill inflation, because really you kill inflation by killing the economy. You know, people are talking about raising not just interest rates, which punish sort of first home buyers and people who have recently taken out a mortgage, but you could enforce mandatory lifting of KiwiSaver rates, you could raise fuel taxes, you could raise GST. I mean, these have been debated and debunked to various extents. Some of them aren't really credible, but there is a discussion going on out there about whether this is the best way to cure our economy of inflation. And interestingly, Paul Conway, the Reserve Bank's chief economist, mentioned last week in Parliament that one of the reasons why New Zealand's recession is so painful during a period of high interest rates is that our economy is so unproductive. Everyone has inflation after the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. It's pretty normal. But the United States economy has continued to grow through that period, continued to hire people, largely because the American economy is much, much more productive than ours. And it means that when the Reserve Bank really wants to bash inflation out of the economy, it ends up causing quite a lot of collateral damage.
Yeah, it seems so cruel.
Which you're seeing everywhere.
Yeah.
It is cruel. I mean, it's one of those things where it really is the lesser of two evils. And actually, think this is so bad at the moment that people are actually debating whether it is the lesser of two evils. So it will be interesting in the coming years whether that debate gets reopened.
Is this what austerity looks like?
Austerity has no sort of dictionary definition. So Labour's finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds has been using the austerity word. Austerity is kryptonite for a government. So Nicola Willis, the finance minister, has been desperate to sort of to avoid the austerity word.
This is a fiscally responsible budget, the most fiscally responsible in 7 years.
Austerity is generally viewed as clamping down on public spending to right the government's books, get back into surplus, pay down debt. The government is spending more every year. It is increasing spending on health, potentially not as much as is needed, but it is increasing health spending by about $1.4 billion this year and in subsequent years.
That's not how Bernard Hickey sees it.
We've got all sorts of things that the government provides, be it education, health, social welfare, where services are being cut back. Now, this wasn't the promise, of course, of the government. They said that they'd be able to cut the spending without cutting the frontline services. But the situation in Health NZ is the perfect illustration of where that's difficult to do, particularly when you inherit infrastructure, a system which is already at breaking point after decades of underfunding. And I think that's the thing that maybe even surprised the government is how much pressure there is building inside our demand for public services, mostly because population growth has been so strong and because politicians, understandably, and voters don't want to formally reduce the scale of the public services that they normally expect to get for free. And we're seeing the breaking point in lots of different ways in a cascading series of crises. And the real test of, how it's working or not working for the public is the number of people who are simply leaving because housing is too unaffordable and because we're seeing so much stress inside those public services.
It had to happen though, didn't it? Because our level of debt is so high.
That's absolutely wrong. It's a story that's been told to the New Zealand public, which is demonstrably wrong. New Zealand has low public debt. And compared to countries where you have heard stories of austerity, Britain and Greece, our debt is less than a third of that debt. And also, you have to simply challenge the there is no money and we can't afford this idea, because there is $250 billion sitting in bank accounts that people have built up over recent years, much of it from payouts from the government through the form of the wage subsidies. And, there are some people in New Zealand right now who are doing very well. They're sitting on trillions of dollars worth of assets. They are receiving large chunks of money from their term deposit accounts. It's just wrong that we can't afford it.
You can't say that it's austerity if your definition of austerity is no increases to spending. You could say that it's austerity if the increase is not sufficient to cover what is needed, because there has been some modelling that's put out by a union of medical professionals which notes that actually on a population growth basis there probably isn't enough money going into health, and that we are going backwards in terms of the proportion of per person spending on health. That might not be austerity, but it's certainly not the definition of appropriate funding of health. In other departments, you probably could argue that there is austerity. So a few weeks ago, Nicola Willis stood up in the House and announced quite by chance that most government departments will not see an increase in funding next year in the next budget. So what that means is that, every year, just as we expect a pay rise as employees because inflation goes up, we need more money to stand still. So next year, public service departments, some of them are not going to get increased funding from the government, and they're going to have to fund the increased cost of their doing business by looking within their own baselines and essentially cutting things and economising to ensure that they have enough money to keep the lights on. So that probably is, for some departments, that would be what you'd call austerity. And real austerity is real terms cuts, and we haven't had that where the nominal amount of spending goes backwards. That is very, very rare and hasn't really been done in modern times, even in the early 90s.
Bernard Hickey, he says that there's been no need to be this harsh.
There is this idea that somehow the government is just like a household, that when times are tough that it should pull its belt in. In effect, that's not the case. The government is a different thing. It can actually support the economy, and it can make sure, for example, that jobs don't get lost, and particularly the government itself doesn't contribute to a contracting economy, which this government has through its various actions to freeze spending, cut jobs, and in particular to essentially freeze activity in the construction and roading sectors. You only have to look at the report out this week from EBOS, a survey of 650 builders, which shows that their orders have collapsed, that the order flow, particularly from councils and from the government itself through Kāinga Ora, has slowed to a halt, and that means that they are now working at just 2/3 capacity, whereas a year ago they were over 80% capacity. That's what happens when a government applies the screws to the economy. It squeezes it down and people have to stop work.
But the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, wouldn't call it austerity. In fact, when Tama Pōtaka said it 4 times in an interview on News Hub in March.
What we've been really focused on is getting some fiscal austerity back into the game and making sure that law and order...
Fiscal austerity? Is that what we're eyeing up?
No,
austerity.
Fiscal austerity and responsibility.
Austerity is a big word to use.
Well, it's responsibility, it's austerity, but it's something that we need to...
Are we actually going into austerity in which there's going to be zero budgets again?
The Prime Minister came in and said it's fiscal responsibility. It is, isn't it? I mean, what about this argument that the next generation is inheriting a massive debt?
Well, that's just not true, that it's fiscally irresponsible. What's fiscally irresponsible is screwing the economy down now so that those people in the future inherit higher unemployment, worse public services. And also, you've got to remember that the generations to come are also inheriting past infrastructure underinvestment. If you continue to do infrastructure underinvestment, you're also bequeathing a deficit. There's already a $100 billion deficit in infrastructure spending. By screwing down spending now, particularly on infrastructure, on housing, then you bequeath a housing shortage, stress public services to future generations. And remember, this idea, and we've got to put this into the bigger picture here. And I think a lot of New Zealanders have not understood what's different between now and in 1984 and in 1990, when we did have an existential threat to the nation's finances when the government was heavily indebted. Back in 1984 and in 1990, the government of the day, Rob Muldoon, and the first year or two of the Jim Bolger, Ruth Richardson government, they had a real debt problem. And that was because New Zealand had foreign currency debt that it had to service in US dollars or pounds or Swiss francs. And it had, for most of that period, a very fixed exchange rate. And when you have a fixed exchange rate and you borrow in foreign currency, you can effectively bankrupt the country. But it's different now because the New Zealand government borrows in its own currency for long terms in fixed interest securities. So that means if there's a shock, if interest rates go up, or if the New Zealand dollar goes down, that means nothing to the New Zealand government. And fundamentally, the New Zealand government has the ability to spend money into the economy and to pay its bills, whatever the case, as long as it is a debt that is in New Zealand dollars.
It's very hard to find someone who is concerned about the level of New Zealand's ability to continue borrowing. There's been a bond auction recently, which has been, and bond auctions are where New Zealand goes into the market and sells its debt. Says, look, we need to borrow some money. Do you want to lend some money to us? And it is profoundly oversubscribed. However much debt we want to offer the world actually wants even more of our debt because they're so convinced that we are a credible borrower. So our ability to borrow is not in question. We'll be fine. The pushback that's always made by Treasury and people in defence of fiscal restraint and reducing our debt load is that New Zealand has to be aware that we are a shaky, vulnerable country where very costly disasters are inevitable and regular, and that you don't just have to look at the level of borrowing that we have at the moment, but you need to price on top of that more climate change-induced cyclones and a Wellington earthquake. So you sort of have to look at our numbers and put on a few tens of billions on top of them. So the argument for fiscal restraint and being more conservative than countries like Australia is that New Zealand is just inherently more vulnerable.
And so that's really the key thing that's behind this fiscal discipline?
Yeah, the government's goal, and to be fair, this was a goal shared by the last government too, is we return to an obligal surplus. That means that the operating revenues of the government, tax revenue, etc., that is more money than the operating spending of the government. So you earn more than you spend, and then you are in a better fiscal position. You grow your economy, so the debt as a percentage of GDP shrinks, and that basically means you're a really, really credible borrower because the markets look at you and they look at you and they say, well, look, they are in a very good fiscal position to be able to take on this borrowing. Seal of approval from the ratings agencies, our borrowing costs stay low, and it means that when something bad happens, when the Alpine fault goes, we can pick up the phone to the bond market and say, we need billions of dollars, please help us. That's what the government, is mindful of.
The big question is, though, these shops and cafes that have had to shut, the young people who've left the country, the other job losses, is it doing lasting damage in a place like Wellington, for example, or when the economy starts picking up again, are those shops going to fill up with, a new business?
Both of your questions are probably the answer to both of them is yes. So when you look at the amount of money that's going to flow into the economy as interest rates get cut, those households in the next couple of years are going to see their mortgages refix at much lower interest rates, and they will have potentially hundreds of dollars a week extra to spend. So the shops and restaurants will eventually reopen as those interest rates fall and households get spending again. The question about lasting damage is a really good one. And that probably goes back to the Paul Conway comment about New Zealand really getting punished twice because of its low productivity rate. We did see the last time we had an interest rate spike prior to the GFC, and then we had a major construction downturn, which we're seeing again this time round. Construction's one of the first industries, one of the worst affected industries when you have high interest rates, because obviously businesses borrow a lot of money to build big buildings or lots of houses. When interest rates are high, they're much less inclined to do that. That often means that those skilled construction workers are laid off and move to Australia, and when they get to Australia, they discover higher wages, a better quality of life, and they don't come home. And so you see when the economy gets dragged out of the recession again, that construction takes a long time to recover because the government, the construction firms discover they've got access to this cheap borrowing again. They're ready to build more buildings and houses. They pick up the phone to all of their old labourers and find that they've moved to Australia. Last time round, one of the problems with our housing crisis, the construction industry took far too long to return to its capacity of building homes. And the real risk this time around is that we have all the intentions to turn around the housing crisis, but no one to pick up a hammer and actually build the homes. And that's lasting damage.
Bernard, is it all related to our high inflation though as well? Are these measures also related to efforts to get inflation down and get, costs down so that people don't face this cost of living crisis?
It is an acceptable thing for a government to restrain its spending when there is real restrictions on resources in the economy. There is other ways to do that. For example, you could shift resources around in the economy, and you can make sure that a government itself doesn't contribute to inflation. But unfortunately, that's not what's happened here. The moment the government got in, it looked to push costs out to consumers, taxpayers and ratepayers by freezing capital and other spending on councils, and then by increasing a range of fees from car registration fees, pharmaceutical pickup fees, a whole bunch of things that have effectively added 0.5 percentage point to the annual inflation rate in the last 6 months. There's a good case to argue that if the government hadn't administered price increases and is continuing to do so, for example, just in the last week, they've doubled the cost of migration fees, they're putting up fees for international tourists. Those are contributing to inflation, adding to inflation, and stopping the Reserve Bank from cutting interest rates faster. And if the government had not administered that inflation, pushed those extra price increases into the economy, inflation now would be under 3%, and the Reserve Bank would be within its rights to start cutting interest rates, which would itself take pressure off consumers and actually reduce inflation too.
Do you think that we're going to pull through roundabout, mid to late 2025?
It really depends on the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates aggressively. It also depends on the government changing the trajectory of its spending, because at the moment they are winding back spending, particularly as a share of the economy. There is no sign yet of a ramping up of house building through Kāinga Ora or anywhere else. And also, we now have a new shock that's just hit the economy in the last 2 or 3 weeks. That is the electricity price shock, rippling through the export economy, costing jobs, and it should force the government to re-examine what it's doing. Yes, it can do things to keep inflation low, but it can also do things to support the economy when it's in trouble, just as the national government of 2008 to 17 did. And the old idea that austerity is the response to a tough economy is, A, it's wrong. It's been proven not to work. And it's exactly the wrong thing to do when your economy is under stress.
And if you want to know more about those electricity price shocks, check out the podcast on the energy crisis we did last week. That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell. Thank you to Thomas Coughlin and Bernard Hickey. I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Mā te wā.